Kia ora, uh, na mihi o te ahi ahi, no mai hari mai, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Stephen McDougall. I'm a director at Studio Pacific Architecture. I'm going to be introducing Michael, but just starting off with a little bit of housekeeping. While an interloper at Engineering New Zealand, apologies for that, but bathrooms just through the wall through here, there is an egress which is signposted adjacent to the toilets. The men's bathrooms are in fact just on the other side of the lift, and there is a secondary means of egress just through the studio, and we're going to follow Bridget if we need to in that case. And of course, in the event of an earthquake, we'll do the usual drop, cover and hold, and assuming that we're in a good place being in Engineering New Zealand. In terms of my involvement, along with Bridget from Engineering New Zealand, Lauren, and Mike Kerr, and until recently Megan Berger, and now recently joined by Sean and Abby from Engineering New Zealand. We make up a small but energetic, enthusiastic, and determined committee in Wellington focused on driving the diversity agenda. And both in Wellington and across the country, and focused on making a change. We've initiated a series of events, including today's in Wellington. Some of these sessions have been taken up in other centres, but across the country, and there is more momentum happening, but we do seem to be leading the charge. As part of that, we're always interested in new and interesting, relevant topics, people, ideas, and so if anyone has any that they think would be pertinent to the ongoing conversations and that we can plot in through the year, a little note to the diversity agenda website or email address would be appreciated. Today, particularly timely given the week anniversary of the tragic events from last weekend or last Friday, and I guess as an agenda that the focus is also around inclusion and tolerance, and Michael will talk about that, and as part of being quiet, that is around understanding other personalities. But there's some bigger issues, of course, that has played out since or during last Friday and since. In terms of today's running, we're scheduled to finish at 1:30. Michael running till about 1:15, and then followed up with some questions. Engineering New Zealand will be welcoming you to stay for 1:30 for the call to prayer, and then the 1:32 for the 2-minute silence. So if you're still here, we'll go out into the foyer and join the rest of Engineering New Zealand. Yes, for those who need to dash away, of course, do that prior to that. So today gives me great pleasure to introduce Michel Davis. I've known Michael for many years, both at Victoria University as colleagues, and that goes back some way, of course, and then over the last 20 odd years as a friend and colleague at Studio Pacific, where Michael is a senior principal. Just in terms of Michael, he has a very big brain. No pressure. He topped economics in first year university, and much to the horror of his father, chose architecture over economics. And we are, and many of our clients and collaborators, the happy recipients of that decision. Michael has a very keen interest in and deep understanding of the human psyche, and he's used this to great effect on many of our commercial interiors and architectural projects. Part of this understanding comes from his delving into his own personality and type traits and issues that run along with that. He'll talk about some of those today, but it might come as a bit of a surprise to you, the learnings from that, given his apparent confidence, great ability to communicate so succinctly, clearly, and confidently. But I'll leave that over to Michael, no pressure. And just in terms of introducing the topic itself, I'll leave that to Michael. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. Hope that's not too loud. Okay, kia ora koutou. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming along and taking an interest in this topic. I'm conscious that this is in the context of a diversity agenda, in particular around gender, but I think that there are some lessons to learn from what I am going to talk about, and is that wider theme of inclusion. Just a few sort of personal kind of housekeeping things. There's no need for you to take notes. It is being recorded and you will be able to access the PowerPoint later on. You've all got a copy of a questionnaire that's actually in the book. It's a somewhat sort of simplistic way of determining if you are an introvert, but it also saves me having to read out 20 questions as I go through my PowerPoint. On the back, there's a post-it note, and the reason for that is that I'm hoping that if you're the sort of person that doesn't typically ask a question in these situations, you might be encouraged by that process where you can just write on the note, and we'll find a way to get that up here and I can read the question out and reflect back, because again, it's usually the same sort of people that put their hands up and ask questions. I also, just before I get started, just want to say, look, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a facilitator, I'm not a neuroscientist. I am an architect, and I had the comment made to me recently, an architect is kind of a specialist in being a generalist, and that's, you know, and Stephen's introduction, I think, covered that. Anyway, we'll get underway. I've got multiple technologies here. Okay, so my talk is largely based on this book here. It does actually say Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, by Susan Cain. I read the book about 5 years ago, and it's one of those ones, occasionally you're lucky in life where you do read a book that is transformative. For me, it was transformative in several ways. One was it gave me a deeper understanding in some of the issues that I had certainly confronted or faced when I was doing workplace design, and in particular the open plan workplace, and the kind of comments that I was getting from people. And also in myself, understanding that while I could appear confident in certain situations, I was in fact an introvert, and what that means. Okay, sorry, got to get the right technology. Yep. Okay, and to which I would add to the subtitle of the book, and where they think it's better to work in groups. And the reason for that is certainly it comes through quite strongly in the book that there's some real myths around collaboration. So I hope to kind of talk to those issues as well. So this is Susan Cain here. This is a promotion for her TED Talk. It's still in the top 25 most popular TED Talks. Last time I looked, there was something like 21 million hits on it. It's quite a charming sort of 20-minute summary of the book. She begins with a sort of a nice little story about going to summer camp as a young American. And for those that have understand what summer camp's about from watching films in the US, clearly it's a very sort of vibrant, sporty kind of endeavor, and she turned up with a whole lot of books, wondering why people didn't want to sit around and read books, and that was her introduction. The book was originally published in 2012, and she sort of, while she originally trained as a lawyer, she now kind of makes a living, I guess, championing this particular topic. So what am I going to talk about? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about some background to personality in general, because introversion, extroversion is really just one aspect. What specifically makes an introvert? What's the difference between introversion and shyness? And then sort of jumping to kind of what's the problem, the kind of paradigm in which we operate, something about introvert leaders, and collaboration versus solitude, the value of solitude, acting like an extrovert, a phrase that I got from the book called the restorative niche, which is quite a useful sort of thing, and then a bit about what are good ways to manage work and collaborate, and then finally, given the context of this, just sort of some kind of gender overlay to this, and then finishing hopefully with some questions. So the first thing is, some of you may be familiar with this model that's sort of sometimes known as the Big Five, and the acronym OCEAN. And it occurred to me just recently that OCEAN's quite nice because there really are as many personality types as there are droplets of water in the ocean. It's kind of simplistic, something like the Myers-Briggs model, which narrows us down to 16 types. Most of these terms, the openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreement, are sort of all fairly sort of self-explanatory, and those words there kind of describe what those are about. The one I probably have the most difficulty with is the word neuroticism. It's as someone who considers myself perhaps a little more on the sensitive end of the spectrum, I don't particularly want to be known as neurotic, and sometimes this big five, they replace the N with an S, but that's not such a handy mnemonic anyway. So and I think it's important, of course, to remember that any population is essentially a bell curve. So anyway, and this is where the complexity around this particular part, this discussion of the ocean model, it comes later in the book, and it really is because I think what Susan Cain found was that when the book was published, people would sort of say, well, I'm an introvert and I don't do that, and I'm an extrovert and I do that. And it's really just a reminder that things are much more complex than that. So she very much prefers to see her book very much from introversion versus extroversion from a cultural viewpoint. So it's kind of broadly the difference, or the dichotomy of the person of contemplation versus a person of action. And so if you look at the definition of something like the person of contemplation, you'll see that term thin skin, for example, or really another way of saying sensitive. So that's really kind of that aspect of neuroticism in the ocean description. And then when you look at the person of action, you're going to see the term risk-taking, which might then kind of take its cue from the ocean, from the ocean model, that openness to new experiences. I should say the term introvert versus extrovert was originally coined by Jung in about 1921. Prior to that, there didn't used to be that kind of phrase. The introversion versus extrovert divide is sometimes described as the north and south of temperament. It is seen as pretty much the most fundamental personality difference. The reason for the fish tank thing there is that there was some experiments done, and somebody had this massive aquarium with a school of fish swimming around, a particular species, all the same species, and they would drop something new into the aquarium. And what they realized, it was always the same fish that were coming to look at the new object and investigate the new object. And it was always the same fish that were continuing to kind of swim around in the periphery. And in fact, this is across multiple kind of species of animal, you do get that difference. And sometimes it's described as sort of being reward oriented versus threat oriented. And in evolutionary terms, you'd have to say, well, what's in it for both of those groups? Well, of course, the fish that go to investigate, okay, sometimes it's going to be an item of food that they manage to get to, but alternatively, it might be something that's not so good for them. And for the ones that are swimming around the perimeter, what's in it for them? Because they're not getting the food source, but then they might also notice the big shark approaching and get out of the way more quickly. So you can see how, this, as I say, in evolutionary terms, may be beneficial. So at its basic level, introversion is a preference for environments that are not overstimulating, and that's principally because introverts are much more sensitive to stimulation. And the reason for the picture of the lemon wedge there is that one of the sort of experiments that, and apparently this is sometimes done in sort of Psych 101 classes, is that you can empty your mouth of spittle, get yourself nice dried out, then take a couple of teaspoons of lemon juice, and then you will start to salivate. And the amount of saliva that you produce is an indication of how sensitive you are to that stimulation, and therefore how introverted you are. So extroverts, by and large, produce a lot less saliva than introverts. Anyways. And in fact, that kind of sensitivity is not only a physical sensitivity, it can also be an emotional sensitivity. So one of the books that gets quoted quite a lot in Cain's book is Elaine Aron's The Highly Sensitive Person. In fact, that's where she first learns about the fish example and things like that. Okay, so about a third to a half of us are considered to be on the introverted side, but of course, just a reminder again that this is a spectrum, So in a classic kind of bell curve, you're going to get very introverted people, very extroverted people, and the bulk are going to be in the middle in a group that is kind of typically called ambiverts, in the sense that they can switch from side to side. So one of the key discoveries for me in this book was the fact that introversion is not the same as shyness, and frequently the terms are used, interchangeably. But shyness is very much a fear of social disapproval or humiliation, basically the risk of, having to put your hand up and ask a question in a group situation. And apparently, it's literally painful for shy people to do that. Um, this is perhaps where we can discuss a little bit of gender. So, if you do something as basic as search for an image on shyness in Google, you'll find that typically it's females that show up in that, and that's because shyness is seen as a much more acceptable female trait. And in fact, sort of we go back to kind of the archetypal image of the demure housewife of the 1950s. Shyness was very much enculturated. If you're looking at introversion, you're actually more likely to find men show up as slightly more introverted than females, but it's not. But in terms of sort of physiology, there's no real difference in genders. So if you combine those things, you get this kind of quadrant, if you like, of sort of people appear, confident versus shy, introvert versus extrovert, the ambivert in the middle. So if we go to the sort of top right of those boxes there, that's your classic kind of media person. I always think of someone like John Campbell. He just loves being in the public eye. He really loves engaging with people. He's happy with whatever stimulation is going on. If we go more to the left, the book gives the example of Bill Gates, who, as a kind of computer nerd, is probably more on the introverted scale, but he's also okay in the public eye, but he doesn't really seek it out. And then going down to the kind of Barbara Streisand example, extrovert, shy. I prefer the example I can think of is many years ago, I worked in London, and the receptionist where I worked was a young woman, very shy, never said anything, which is not an ideal character trait, I should say, for a receptionist. But then every night, and she would go out and listen to heavy metal, sort of punk music, and just so wanting that kind of stimulation to balance the kind of lack of it during the day, if you like. So, and then we get down to the kind of bottom left quadrant, where you are going to find your sort of, again, typical artist or creative person. There's the quote from T.S. Eliot from The Wasteland: "I will show you fear in a handful of dust," and I think that captures what the sort of the sensitivity and the pain, if you like, of being that shy introvert. Okay, so these are the questions that are on a bit of paper that you've got. As I say, it's a bit of a as any quiz is. Typically, well, in our professions of, say, architecture and engineering, and I appreciate there are other people from other professions here, but introverts do, according to Myers-Briggs, show up a lot more. If you sort of score in the kind of 9, 10, 11, you're probably in that ambivert territory. I did this with our studio a few years ago, and the kind of average result we got was about 13, but I had we got a 19 and a couple of 18s and a few more 17s. So there's clearly were some quite introverted people in the studio, and less so with extroverts. Was sort of, I think the lowest mark was something like 5 or something like that, but there were certainly a few around the 8s and things. So yeah. And so then the other 20 questions over, I'll just go to this. So, but just kind of broadly comparing introvert versus extrovert. So the introvert, and as I go through these, I do tend to think about the fish, is that the introverts, predominantly are in their own mental self. I mean, if you are the fish that's kind of floating around, you probably will start to develop something going on in your head. Whereas extroverts do very much seek gratification outside of themselves. The introverts, as I've said before, they're sensitive to the stimulation, so they avoid it, whereas extroverts will tend to seek it out. The introvert, the fish on the periphery, is the observer. The extrovert is to go in and participate. Introverts typically, they do prefer quieter environments, and the extroverts noisier. And the book is sort of full of genuine scientific experiments where these things are proven. And they did a word game kind of experiment with introverts and extroverts. They played a particular noise intermittently, and the introverts and the extroverts had to choose on what their preference was, as something that's not too loud, not too quiet. And the introverts on average chose something at 55 decibels, and the extroverts were at 72 decibels. Okay, and that was good. That gave them good performance. Then what they did is they played the louder noise to the introverts and the quieter noise to the extroverts, and their performance deteriorated quite a lot. So it was kind of trying to find that sweet spot around stimulation. Introverts, typically, prefer a more friendly manner, and extroverts, are more comfortable or prefer a more aggressive manner. And again, as I say this, this what's going to happen is that I'll get to the end of this talk and people say, "Well, I'm an extrovert, but I don't mind that sort of language." As again, it's just sort of remembering that it is more complex than that. The next one is preferring more nuanced language versus more black and white. And the best example I can think of this is that my younger brother, or one of my younger brothers, and he's very much an extrovert, and I will send him a text message that's sort of very nuanced and grammatically correct and fully punctuated and all that sort of thing. And if I get more than 3 words from him, I think, well, I've actually done pretty well, because it's usually the thumbs up, the thumbs down, or some other sort of thing. And so I think understanding that, and understanding that that's a personality thing. It's not that he doesn't like me and he doesn't reply unlike. It is just the way he is. It's not necessarily a bad thing. What else we got? Oh, yeah. And so introverts have fewer friends. Extroverts have a lot of friends. I mean, again, that's probably debatable, but I think it's important to make the point that introverts are not necessarily less sociable in any way. They just sort of socialize in a slightly different way, and they typically, in conversation, will want to. They're not so good at small talk. They want to kind of get onto deeper topics, and then perhaps revert to the more general one about what's the weather and what do you do. And I must confess, I do find myself doing this, as I'll sort of get in deep and dirty with someone, and then I'll sort of remember to ask them, about their children or their partner or something like that. So, and then introverts, the sort of watch and wait, and the extroverts just do it. And again, if you think about the fish, that's the kind of situation you're going to see. And then introverts here typically prefer to work more slowly and deliberately, and one task at a time. Extroverts are much more happy multitasking, tackling several projects and things like that. It's not mentioned in the book, but it does occur to me that it's something like design. You do see perhaps those personality preferences expressed both in the designer and, of course, perhaps in the person commissioning the work. And so, on the left is a design by Gerald Parsonson, who, if you met Gerald, he's definitely sort of falls into the quiet, introvert, considerate person. On the right is work by John Mills, and who, if you meet him, he's definitely falls into the extrovert category. And of course, but we have to remember that overlying this is things like fashion. So the minimalist aesthetic is currently much more fashionable, and we don't have those sort of richer interiors necessarily. Okay, so what's the problem? Apart from him, there's Susan Cain makes the point that there has been this shift in the Western world. In fact, I should make one point. The book it quotes a lot of American data, and it does have that overlay. And she acknowledges that in fact American culture is by nature more supportive of extroverts. And she does spend a chapter or two on sort of, for example, Chinese culture, where more quietude is actually seen as something more positive. And so, for an example of this shift of the culture of character to the culture of personality, it happened in the case of the States in the late 19th century, as people came off the land and started to come into cities, and they had to sort of make themselves stand out a little bit. And one of the most popular selling books in 1899 was called Character, the Grandest Thing in the World. So it was, and they did this analysis of book titles and book contents, and they found that there was this real emphasis on character. And then by 1936, you're getting Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, which is all about the public persona that you presented. And even to the extent that Toastmasters, I don't know if they're still called Toastmasters, have this thing called the truth or lie exercise. So again, it's not about what's your true integrity. It's about how you present yourself. And I'm sure that well, we've seen it in our own culture, if you like, the urbanization of Māori. I would have thought that on the marae, the sort of smaller marae environment, it may be possible to really determine the true character of someone. But that urbanization process means it's very hard to do that. And the model that we've kind of ended up with is really the person that can kind of do the most, I don't know, guess you like alpha male type behavior, stand out, whatever. They're going to be the ones that we tend to elevate. And in parallel with this, there's certainly been a growing lack of acceptance of quiet and thoughtful people. In 1980, social anxiety disorder, which is really another term for shyness, was added to the American manual, I think it's Statistical and Diagnostic Manual, which is the one of sort of medical or mental conditions or something like that. And you talk to teachers, and I do this in some of the education work, and they say, yeah, it's always the parents coming to me and expressing concerns about their quiet, thoughtful, self-contained child, rather than their ebullient, highly sociable, very, very confident child. So we are expressing a prejudice effectively by doing that. And so, yeah, and a lot of systems, really support this. And of course, in order to survive in this extrovert bias world, a lot of us have to pretend to be extroverts, and I'll talk about that a bit later on, but that can actually take a bit of a toll on you. And so overall, much of the modern world is geared towards people that thrive on sort of group, highly social activities and like high levels of stimulation. And just to give you an example, I was quoting somebody recently, when I was younger, a fine dining experience was you went to a restaurant and it had carpet on the floor and it had velour curtains and there might be some light music playing in the background, but you could certainly hold a conversation very easily. But then about a year ago, I went to Charlie Noble's, which is held up as being a very good restaurant or whatever, and I happened to be down towards the end where the kitchen part is. And to me, it was just such a complete assault on my senses, the noises, the smells, or what have you. And in typical sort of introvert fashion, I'm trying to have a deep conversation with all the people around the table, asking them, well, what do you think of this environment? And I was really struck by really nobody particularly enjoyed it because they couldn't hear what everyone was saying. They were shouting. They were really tired at the end of it. A number of them admitted that them and their partners just didn't go out that often for this very reason. And the fact is that, and here we are here in an environment that's got, quite hard acoustic to it, is that, the people, we sort of tolerate this, and it's hard to find that. And where did that, or why did that happen? So anyway, I mean, as I say, there's only about a third of a half to us that are really affected by that, but okay, so that's the problem. Oops. So the other thing that's happening in the background is that, what leadership, again, if you have a world that sort of values extrovert traits, then, what about leaders? Now, and certainly there is discovered that, in fact, there's a myth about the typical model of the charismatic leader, especially in business. Lots of studies in the US, have shown that, and there's the very good book, Jim Collins, From Good to Great. And when they look at a number of companies in the US that have been taken from sort of average performers to really good companies, you do find a predominance of introvert leaders. Peter Drucker, who's done a lot of writing on management, he says one of the most consistent things he could find in effective leadership was an absence of charisma. Another study of 128 American companies found that while there were charismatic leaders, the one thing that they were very good at getting themselves paid better, but their performance or effective was no greater. And so typically introverted leaders are much more effective with a proactive employees, whereas extroverts perform better where employees are more passive or kind of, shall I say, less educated, less good at sort of self-initiation. And just to quote it, and again, the book quotes several experiments, but just one was they did this thing and they got a whole lot of people and they were folding T-shirts. And they put two actors in the group, and one of the actors would say to the other, look, I used to do this in Japan. We used to fold it a different way, but it's certainly quicker than this. Probably only take a few minutes to learn, and we could then be, folding more T-shirts. And what they found was when there was an introvert manager with that group, they would be much more open to adopting or listening and adopting and trialing that thing, whereas the extrovert leader really was not that interested in being, I guess, sort of managed from below or listening to new ideas and just kind of wanted to kind of box on. Yeah, and look, I mean, this comes up a lot, and it's a useful reminder. There is little correlation between being a good talker and having the best ideas. And I'm reminded of a thing when I was at university. We were taught about in a communications class about this sort of famous experiment. It's called Dr. Foster, and Dr. Foster was an actor that they sent to a psychology conference, and he was a really good presenter, and he presented all this stuff, and everybody afterwards was, just thought this was the greatest thing, what this person had talked, what Dr. Foster had talked about. And in fact, what Dr. Foster had talked about was actually complete rubbish, but it was just the fact that he was a really good presenter that made people think that he was, he was very good. And it's like that sort of salesman trait, but it's actually trying to see past that. That's the important thing. Okay, so now, and I'm sort of the reason these things make sort of quite big jumps is I'm trying to cover the whole book, but the other theme that comes through is around, collaboration and what the impact of that is on creativity. And this quote from Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm Gladwell's a very smart guy, wrote The Outliers, The Tipping Point, regular contributor to the New Yorker and other magazines. And his this quote here: "Innovation, the heart of the knowledge economy, is fundamentally social." And I've actually used this quote when I'm trying to promote, or have been trying in the past, promote the open plan work environment. But the fact is that in fact, studies actually show that in the creativity or creative people are actually more likely than not to be particularly social. They are more likely to be introverts, or functioning introverts, as they say. And so the question then arises: does that creativity come from something innate within those more introverted people, or is it something to do with actually spending time alone or in solitude that brings that about? And I should say that the Malcolm Gladwell and the examples that he quotes in his books really came about because of online collaboration, and things like Linux software and things like Wikipedia. And the truth is that operating online does yield good results. But if you think about the online environment, that is people that are kind of often operating just by themselves and contributing in the virtual environment. And I think that's a fantastic thing, and it probably has really enabled some introverts to get their value recognised. Hans Eisner quote there: "Introversion concentrates the mind on the task in hand and prevents the dissipation of energy on social and sexual matters unrelated to work." So it's probably a good reason to employ introverts. But Hans Eisner, he was the inventor of the lemon juice experiment. But again, the book's kind of got numerous examples of that sort of thing, that introverts typically are able better to concentrate on things. And so just some examples of successful introverts. And I really like this quote from Steve Wozniak. I'll read it out. "I don't believe anything really revolutionary has been invented by committee. If you're that rare engineer who's an inventor and also an artist, I'm going to give you some advice that might be hard to take. And that advice is work alone. You're going to be best able to design revolutionary products and features if you're working on your own, not on a committee, not on a team." Okay, so that's just one of kind of numerous examples in the book. And Wozniak, co-founder of Apple Computers, he was the archetypal, uncomfortable, shy adolescent that found his niche and has done really well. And then another book that, and I'll one day hope to do a talk on this one, Guy Claxton's Harebrained Tortoise Mind, and a lot of that is about the value of solitude and contemplation as a way to sort of tap into what's going on in your brain. I'm always struck by the fact that there are trillions of synaptic connections going on all the time in our brain, and how do we tap into that? I won't read the Kafka quote, but it does kind of capture the value of just letting stuff arise. And I think when people do talk about those moments of inspiration, that's the kind of thing that they're talking about. And in fact, that book is about how you tap into that aspect of your mind. Okay, so we know that, or there are these experiments, if you like, that demonstrate that solitude is valuable. But the fact is, and we do very much support individuality, but do we create workplaces and schools, and that's kind of reflecting my areas of interest, if you like, to encourage that. And I mentioned before about that sort of web-based collaboration has really prompted the removal of walls, if you like, in these other ones. And so office space, that example there, the statistic of office space, and I'd say the same in New Zealand, is that I remember when Stephen and I were working on projects in the sort of 90s, and you'd be working on 20 to 22 square meters per person in an office fit out. And the workplace guidelines for NB now are about 12 to 16, but certainly we're involved in projects that are getting down to maybe 10 to 12 square meters per person. So we're really sort of, cramming people in. I think it's also quite ironic that image on the right-hand side, admittedly it's a few years old when you look at the computers, that's from Norman Foster, so a well-known architect, their office in London. I sort of can't help be struck by the fact that a lot of creative people are being expected to operate in that very, what I would find quite a sort of stimulating and distracting environment. And then the same can be said of our school environments. Many of you will have, like me, sort of started school sitting at an individual desk, and then they got all collected up in pods. And now, desks actually sort of there's fewer of those around anyway. And we go to this sort of that illustration there of the modern or innovative learning environment. And I was involved in the design of a school about 2 or 3 years ago, and I went and visited Amesbury School out in Churton Park, and this is held up as one of the sort of best innovative learning environments in the country. And look, there's some great stuff being done there, but I couldn't help but notice that there were also a reasonable number of children literally kind of hiding under whatever object, table, chair, or whatever that they could find, just trying to get away from the kind of distraction and noise of the thing. And the head teacher there also, she sort of recognised that to some extent because she wanted to make sure that there was not too much stuff stuck up on walls. So she wanted to have a pretty simple aesthetic, which I do struggle with that a bit. I think you should, could have an environment where you can stick stuff up on the wall and perhaps achieve a calmness in other ways. Okay, so what's the proof, if you like, to support some of these things about in this particular case, the working environment? Okay, so there's a well-known experiment by DeMarco and Lister and it was specifically to look at the impact on of workplace density. It was to do with coding war games, and I can't quite work out whether they were actually doing war games or when it was a sort of coding war games or something like that, as in computer coding. Now, for those that aren't sort of computer coders, coding can be done a bit like I draw an analogy with a mathematical proof, that you can do a mathematical proof in sort of maybe 25 steps, and it's not particularly elegant, but it kind of gets you there in the end. Or you can do it in 4 very elegant steps, and that's and mathematicians do kind of like getting an elegant proof. Anyway, so they got a whole lot of people. They had to do it during normal working hours in the usual office. 600 software developers, 92 companies. Now, the first thing they found was there was a really big performance gap, which for us that use computers is slightly concerning because it does make you realize there's probably a lot of kind of not particularly elegant coding in your computer or piece of software. But more importantly, the best performers, and they sort of ended up discovering this because they made sure that they had at least 2 people from each company, and that's what alerted to them to the fact that it seemed to be an association between the environment and what the outcome was. But what they found, it wasn't the experience or time spent on it, it was where the workplace had the most privacy, personal space, staff control over their physical environment, and freedom from interruption. And again, there's a lot of stuff on the web, TED Talks and things like that. I can think of one by Jason Fried called "Why Work Isn't Done at Work," and he talks about the M&Ms, which is meetings and managers. Just these interruptions, and interruptions can be quite. If somebody interrupts you, it actually takes quite a few minutes to get your head back in the game. And he actually recommends something called No Talk Thursdays. So it's yeah. Okay. So the problem with the Openplan Office, and because I actually were quite passionate about this, I'm actually going to read from the book. So the coding war games are well known in tech circles, but DeMarco and Lister's findings reach beyond the world of computer programmers. A mountain of recent data on Openplan offices from many different industries corroborates the results of the games. Openplan offices have been found to reduce productivity and impair memory. They're associated with high staff turnover. They make people sick, hostile, unmotivated, insecure. Openplan workers are more likely to suffer from high blood pressure and elevated stress levels and to get the flu. They argue more with their colleagues. They worry about co-workers eavesdropping on their phone calls and spying on their computer screens. They have fewer personal and confidential conversations with colleagues. They're often subject to loud and uncontrollable noise, which raises heart rates, releases cortisol, which is the body's fight or flight stress hormone, and makes people socially distant, quick to anger, aggressive, and slow to help others. So it sort of paints a fairly bleak picture of the Openplan environment. I'd like to think that in Studio Pacific we have designed some well-designed Openplan work environments, and of course some of that is to do with the culture of organisations, and some of our own research has actually demonstrated that some of this comes from culture and not just from environment. But anyway, so as I say, a bit of a bleak picture. And so, given the choice, many people would prefer to work alone, and that's much more so for creative people. And in my kind of workplace design, I have often come across the people saying, I'll say, well, what do you do if you want to do really quiet, concentrated work? And I say, well, I'll work from home. It's like work is not, the workplace is not necessarily the place that you do work. And the other, I'll ask people like, where did you have your last great idea? It's seldom at work, so our workplaces, I think in many cases, people just come to work because of the social aspect. And we know this as we move to more towards more flexible working, as people also don't really want to be stuck at home all the time either. And Susan Cain actually admitted that quite a bit of the book she wrote while typing on a laptop in a cafe, because she liked the fact that she could just be aware, have a sense of connection to her fellow humans, a little bit of background noise, without anyone disturbing or distracting her. So before kind of we go too negative on the whole kind of collaboration thing, I think it is important to remember that cities, when we began to urbanize, there was major innovation happened as a result of that. So certainly bringing people together can work well, but I think the city also provides us with a useful metaphor, because people can come into a city, and if you perhaps are more extroverted, then you'll probably be quite happy to live in an apartment close to the center of things, where you can go out easily, where you don't mind the noise or whatever. Whereas if you're more introverted, you will want to retire to the suburbs every night, and your place of quietude. And I think that that's the analogy we perhaps have to draw with the workplace, is making sure that we provide that range for people, that they're not sort of always subject to too much city life. So okay, so I was very struck by this particular material around around collaboration. So this is a section I've called the myth of brainstorming. So brainstorming was invented by Alex Osborne of BBDO, an advertising agency. When he invented, he did put some rules around it. You weren't supposed to criticize the ideas that were being presented and things like that. But the fact is that now numerous studies have demonstrated that actually this way of working together is not a good way to get better or more ideas. And to be honest, this doesn't matter whether you're introverts or extroverts. And the reason for this is there's actually three reasons. The first one is evaluation apprehension. If you're presenting something in a group situation, even if people sort of send all kinds of signals about, no, don't worry, we're not going to judge you, the fact is at some level we're reading body language. We know that that person's the boss, even if they say they're interested in our ideas or whatever. So there's that. There's what's called social loafing, is that in a group of 10 people, a couple of people are just going to sit there and sort of, just meld into the background while everyone else does the work. And then there's a pretty obvious one called production blocking, which is if you've got 10 people in a room and we've got to listen to each of their ideas one after the other, or whatever, you unlike doing it perhaps virtually or online, when that can all be happening at the same time, you've basically got 9 people sitting around unable to contribute. And so, and that's why, certainly online brainstorming has been proven to work well. So just another experiment which I found quite striking and actually in a funny sort of way a bit worrying. So this was some experiments done in 2005, and it had been done previously, but they weren't able to work out where the activity was going on in people's brains. So they had those sort of skull caps, the functional magnetic resonance, fMRI things, and so they could see where the action was taking place. And it was very simple test. You had some three-dimensional looking objects, not exactly the ones on the image there, but similar to that. On the right would be one, and on the left, right, would be one, and you'd have to identify whether one was a rotation of the other. And so when people were doing it by themselves, they were typically or incorrect about 13% of the time, but they were very much using the perception and decision-making parts of their brain. But when they worked in groups, what was happening is that they used less of that decision-making part, and they were the prefrontal cortex. They were in fact using the perception part of their brain, and what that meant, and they were also incorrect. And I must admit, in reading about it, I'm not sure whether they sort of planted some actors to give some wrong answers, or whether there was this thing that once people started to sort of suggest, oh, this is not a rotation of that, a kind of group thing happened. But the point is that at some level, we really want to be part of the big group. And there are numerous experiments demonstrating this. I remember seeing one on a documentary on TV once where it was a group very similar to this, and quite a few actors, and then maybe sort of 4 or 5 people that weren't actors, and smoke was coming in through the door. And those 4 or 5 people didn't get up and do anything, just because they were waiting for their cue from the collective. And so this is what a situation like this, if people get in early and sort of, set the scene for something, then they can really affect the perception of others. And in fact, what they found is that if you do dissent from the majority view, you actually get activity in the amygdala, which is the sort of limbic system, the reptile brain, and it's literally sort of the pain of independence. And I've seen this myself. I remember presenting a scheme and a resource consent for a resource consent for a big development. And it was a public group, local neighbours and things like that. I was trying to sort of present in a very rational way or whatever. And up the back was a very noisy and negative person. And then other people gathered in behind her. And it kind of really swung the room, because I think a lot of people had come to the meeting sort of a little bit on the fence, keen to learn. And they said, oh, right, okay, somebody's given me the cue as to how I can behave now. And then there was one person that put their hand up and said, actually, I think what you're doing sounds really good. And that was a very brave thing for that person to do. And the mood of the room just started to swing back, because people in all those fences, oh, right, okay, I can hold the other view, but you can see how situations like that, or more worryingly, things like a jury decision or something, people might actually be influenced. And so it just is a reminder of the importance of good kind of critical thinking, which you're better off trying to do that perhaps by yourself and then coming together rather than being too affected by the group. Okay, so acting like an extrovert. This is a chap that's in the book called Brian Little, and he's got his own TED talk called Confessions of a Passionate Introvert. And he's really making the point that, of course, and I made it earlier on, that a lot of us are adapting to this slightly extrovert biased world by pretending to be extroverts. Brian's one, I think, is sort of described as the equivalent of the kind of Nobel Prize for academic teaching in the US or something like that. So clearly he's very good, but he tells a good story about how he is he talks about his free trait theory, that when you're passionate about something, you should be able to kind of, find that, get that passion and kind of use it to, project yourself. Not like what I'm doing now, perhaps. But anyway, and then there's a bit about, this ability to self-monitor, which is kind of like, I guess, your ability to act. And if we go back to that ocean model, the A stands for agreeableness. Well, again, if you're that more agreeable person, you're perhaps able to adapt, and then you throw in a bit of conscientiousness, and then you're going to work really hard to adapt. So you can see how all these things do come together. And some people who are introverted by nature can appear to be very extroverted. And then anyway, Brian comes up with this phrase, which I really like, called the restorative niche. And he tells a story where he had to go and give a talk. It was every year to, I think it was something like a naval academy or something like that. Anyway, he would be asked to lunch after giving the presentation. But because he knew that the energy of giving the presentation as an introvert would really take it out of him, he would quite deliberately go for a walk around the lake. So he knew that he needed to do the restorative niche. And then unfortunately, they shifted. So then he said, oh, what am I going to do now to get some quiet time? Because he said, he didn't have lunch. So he went and hid in the toilet. And then somebody spotted his shoes and started talking to him in the next cubicle, which to an introvert would be really upsetting. Anyway, so examples of the sort of restorative niches, things like, just going for a walk. I mean, there's the biophilia, that's well-known phenomenon, taking a quiet break, yoga or a meditation. And what I did take from the book, and it is I do now meditate. A way of making sure that I, re-energize if I've had to kind of, give of myself during the day. And then, things like using emails rather than meetings. And I certainly now, in the past, doing briefing sessions or workshops with staff and, in large organizations, and there might be a bit of antipathy towards me from the staff or something like that. I used to do them one after the other, and you just wonder why at the end of the day I was completely shattered. And now I just make sure that I do actually pace them out a little bit. Well, and interesting enough, we should also remember that extroverts also need those niches. So if you're an extrovert and you work in a really quiet somewhat unstimulating work environment, then you need to go out and get your injection, a bit like the young woman I was telling you at the beginning, that go out and listen to your heavy metal music or whatever to get that energy level up. And ultimately, yeah, too much acting out of character can be bad for your health. And in the case of Brian Little, uh, he was that sort of classic introvert combination of, he's a good presenter and he was also very conscientious about doing right by his students and all that sort of thing. And he ended up with double pneumonia and nearly died. So it is quite, that's a bit extreme. Okay, so that's the book. So what do we do with this? And in fact, I quite like this little graphic here because it's quite deliberate that the introverts got the speech bubble in their head and the extroverts jab, jab, jab the ideas, but the first thing is, of course, be aware of the paradigm that we are working within. It does somewhat favour the more extroverted personality. Be aware of the science. I think that, and that certainly would also go across, like there's some really good stuff around gender issues as well, where we like to think that we treat males and females the same, but by God, the science says no, that's not the case. Of course, we need to refine how we work and use and try and use the respective skills, because a bit like the fish example, you do need both types, and many is the successful partnership where there was the extrovert, the reward seeker, together with the introvert, sort of threat-oriented, managing risk. And you also see failed businesses or failed relationships where two people are the same and they don't, they get themselves into all sorts of trouble. And of course, this applies to learning, working, socializing. And in fact, the book, I haven't really got into it, but she also talks quite a lot about family situations. What do you do if you're an introvert and you're married to an extrovert, or you're introvert parents with introvert parents with extrovert kids? And these are quite worthwhile understanding. Okay, so I'll begin with a little bit about management. So the first thing to do is just remember, if you're a manager, that a third to a half of your workforce may in fact be introverts. And in fact, it may not be that obvious, because a lot of them could be, doing what I've done a bit of, is just pretending to be an extrovert. Be aware of and honest about your own personality. So again, that was sort of revelation to me about the book. And I think the more we understand how much stimulation we kind of optimally need, that's good as well. The usual kind of rules around management is we all need good, clear direction, but you might want to adapt that. And I know in our studio that they're introverts, and if I'm directing them about something, I will kind of get into, quite a lot of detail and quite nuanced and covering all the bases. And then there are extroverted people where I will adapt my style and just be much more direct and black and white with them, and they kind of appreciate that. And if you're managing your smart, capable people, then just do what introverts do and just listen and observe, stand back. I think, having sort of regular one-on-ones with shy staff, that's another thing I've kind of learned, is that if you engage more with shy people, shy staff, whatever, they will feel more inclined to talk and engage back with you, because you're making them feel less fearful of that, that engagement, if you like. And just trying to set up structures that work for the range, and that can. It was sometimes requires a bit of negotiation. The best example I can think of is in the book, is an example of a couple. One's very introverted, one's very extrovert, and they sort of start this process. Well, he wants to have people round every week. She sort of says, no, can we make it every 2 weeks? And then he says, I want a dinner party. And she says, look, would it be better if we do the buffet style thing? Because that way I can go and sort of sit over in the corner. And so that's the kind of negotiation that you might get into if you've probably got the extremes. As I say, let's remember that a lot of the population is still sitting in the middle. And giving yourself the opportunity for feedback. This is certainly something we've been trying to do in the studio, is just be more honest about these things. Okay, so then what's a good way to work? I mean, I'm talking more about the environmental things, certainly about creating work settings that provide that range of personality, or provide for that range of personality types. There's this term activity-based working, and some of you might be familiar with that. That's where you don't necessarily have an assigned desk. You just go into a workplace, and if you're doing focused work, you'll sort of sit in one of those focus booths. If you're doing collaborative work, it'll be another one. But I'd like to see perhaps recognition about how these environments might actually work for different personalities, or recognize, you recognize your own personality, because I think that while it's kind of fashionable, the idea that you don't have a assigned desk, I suspect that it's probably could be quite sort of challenging for an introvert to come into work every day and have to find a new place to work. And there's certainly a lot of stuff written online about that. As somebody says, well, it's like arriving in a city and having to find your hotel room. And we do find, some of us don't necessarily like that experience. So um, and typically, yeah, we should, design should allow for people to interact, because we do know, some of that collaboration is useful, without distracting others, and to be able to disappear to private workspaces. The acoustic environment is absolutely crucial, and I think noise is one of those kind of really unrecognised pollutants at the moment. And I'm sure a number of you have worked in situations where the air conditioning goes off at 5:30 or 6 o'clock, all goes quiet, and you think, oh, did I put up with that all day? So, I mean, obviously these things affect introverts more, but in fact, good acoustic environments are really crucial in, for example, the teaching environment, and that doesn't really matter whether you're an extrovert or an introvert. Okay. Oh, so I just quoted that Julian Treasure. Yeah, he's done a series of TED Talks, and other, TED's my go-to for a lot of this stuff. And so just to give you an example of what we do in our work that can work for this. So the diagram on the left-hand side is a kind of concept diagram of the statistics fit out that we did. It's no longer there, so I can show this to you. We did the interior, we didn't do the building. But what happens here is the stair in the middle, so an interconnecting stair. You come up, you go to a kind of noisy and vibrant gathering space in the middle, a bit like the town square, if you like. And then the noise that emanates from that is sort of sheltered from the perimeter open plan work areas by some meeting spaces. And then, and it's almost like a gradient of noise noise and interactivity from the middle of the floor plate out to the perimeter. And then there's quiet rooms on the perimeter. And sort of rather than, often we do have these, quiet rooms and focus rooms and offices these days, but sometimes they're sort of tucked away in something like the equivalent of a coat cupboard. We put them on the perimeter because if you are going to do some of that kind of, good quality solitude thinking, it's quite nice to be able to look out at a view or something like that, and just for them to be pleasant spaces. And then on the bottom right is this school that we did up in Kapiti a couple of years ago. And what this is about, it's in the junior school, so it's children up to about 7, I think, 6 or 7, yeah. And there's a cave, which you can see the opening of, and that gets filled up with cushions, and the more introverted kids really love going in there. And then the extroverted ones can go up the steps and sort of, stand and be on show and act out and show off. And so it's really kind of a little device to try and recognize those two types. Okay. So I just a little bit around, how to collaborate now positively, how to run meetings. So, things like, and a lot of this would be pretty, normal kind of practice for running meetings, but obviously having an agenda. We often, with our briefing work, send out an invitation to people, so that, because it's all about, come along, coming prepared, getting people to do a bit of homework before they come along. If you are running the meeting, get there early, but get that commanding spot. That's just one of those things that you do have to do. You do have to use your body language or your location, even if you are shy or introverted, to set the signal that you are actually chairing the meeting or running it. Making eye contact with people and really watching body language is important as well. The sort of classic one where people start to do that. And if people aren't saying much, ask questions of them, or if you've got the sort of over contributor, perhaps you try and just close them down ever so politely, but use what they're saying to then ask someone else in the room, well, what do you think of that particular idea? So just drawing those more, shy, reticent people into the discussion. And then try to, this is where things get tense or something like that, but you certainly, even reminding people what the purpose of the meeting is just a good way to get people focused back on what they're doing. Obviously the usual one about you making sure you reflect that, and last but not least, don't mistake in the eloquence or assertiveness for the best ideas. It's certainly something that comes through quite a bit in the book. And then the workshop situation, so slightly different to a more formal sort of meeting, is try to work with someone perhaps that complements your type. So if you are an extrovert, have work with an introvert. They'll be more tuned into some of the, reading some of the mood of the room, if you like. Encouraging people to move into work in pairs, because again, shy people are really much more comfortable talking to one other person. And so if you just do that and then get them to perhaps report back, getting people to contribute ideas before you all get in the collective, and that's really trying to overcome that brainstorming problem of evaluation and anxiety and things like that. So, you know, if you are doing a pin-up type thing, then just get everything pinned up before you start commenting on each person's material. Making ideas visible with a graphic record. I do this where, you know, if I'm in a workshop situation, writing up so that if a shy person has sort of taken the risk of saying something, validating what they've said by writing it up is really important. Don't let anyone capture the room early on. You know, the example I gave of the resource consent application, you make sure that you try to kind of shut down that dominance and try to make, yeah, as I say, the mood of the room. I also more and more just acknowledge, as I did at the beginning of this meeting with, or this presentation with the post-it notes, that just acknowledging that there are people that are uncomfortable putting their hand up in this sort of environment and just making it easy for them, and just about being honest, you know. Also talking to quiet or shy people in a break if you do, because again, that's all that thing about making some kind of social connection with someone that then makes them more comfortable to contribute. So, and just a little bit about gender, and it's this phenomenon which many of you may be aware of, the sort of what's known as the double bind. I didn't know it was called that. I'd call it a sort of catch-22 actually, where women are, you know, we're expected to be competent with sort of what you might describe as stereotypically male qualities of, you know, and I would say could be considered extrovert qualities, together with compassionate, which you might say is a little bit more on the introvert or the person of contemplation type of thing. But when they do act more assertively, and the science proves this, they are sort of generally more disliked, or that's not seen as a positive trait. Now, if we were to move to a more temperament inclusive environment, then, you know, first of all, introverts, male or female, would feel more comfortable to contribute to that. But I think women would feel that their sort of behavior was more acceptable. Yeah, so. Okay, so just drawing to a close, which I think we're going okay time-wise. So just in summary, you know, so personality is very complex, and just a reminder about that ocean model is that, you know, it's not as simple as, you know, 16 personality types or something like that. But certainly the introversion, the extroversion split, like the basic split in any species between introvert and extrovert, is pretty fundamental. A reminder that introversion is about sensitivity to stimulation. That's not the same as shyness, which is that fear of humiliation. Value solitude. That doesn't matter whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. It's good for creativity. Manage meetings and workshops in a way that really enables, you know, everyone to contribute in a positive way and not be, you know, sidelined by others. And so same with sort of collaboration as well. As you're trying to bring those individual efforts together, don't expect the collaborative process to generate by itself the good ideas. And of course, create environments that support all these things. And so just really finishing up now. So for the introvert, you know, find ways to be heard, and, you know, and or quietly ask for them. If you're in a situation, you know, do feel empowered to ask that something be modified so you can contribute. Have the courage to pretend to be an extrovert, particularly if you feel passionate about something, and it's, you know, good to kind of push yourself out of your limits sometimes, and find those restorative niches so that you can kind of get your energy rebalanced. For the extrovert, you know, do respect the value that introverts bring. They tend to be the more thoughtful and often creative people in a group. Find ways to make sure that they're heard, and occasionally just pretend to be an introvert yourself. So, you know, listen and observe in the same way in which all the introverts are pretending to be extroverts. Yeah, so I like this cartoon. Reminds me of my wife and I after a party or something. But anyway, so look, we're good to answer questions now. Thank you very much. So I don't know if anybody's had the opportunity to write on a post-it note, but if alternatively, I think there are some microphones up the back if somebody does want to ask any questions. All too shy. Gosh. I think it automatically goes
Is it on?
Yep,
Yes.
yep.
So I have a daughter who's an introvert, and she is in a class which is a shared space class, enormous, with 50 kids and 2 teachers, and she hates it. Any advice?
Oh, well, you do have my sympathy, and yeah, I guess perhaps the restorative niche is the option, is that getting time out. Like at Amesbury School, there were children that, and the principal allowed her office to be used as a workspace for children, right? So I think that that's the kind of thing that you could look at. I mean, in practical terms, it's probably quite hard to get some rebuilding program going on. I mean, when we design those sort of large spaces, we always make sure there's a number of smaller breakout rooms that can be closed. But I think encouraging your daughter to sort of find ways, even in breaks like a morning tea or a lunch break, perhaps to go to the library or something like that where it's quiet rather than out into the playground where it's noisy. That would be, yeah, I mean, in practical terms, yeah. But yeah. Hamish.
Hi, Michael. Sort of a similar question, but I suppose I'm interested in the difference between the modern learning environment and the old days where everyone, sat
Sure.
regimented at their individual desk, and wonder, what the difference is really. I mean, how would that person cope in in the traditional environment, and would that actually be any better?
Yeah. Well, and look, I do see advantages in the innovative learning environment. Like I've seen that sort of team teaching approach where two teachers are teaching a larger group, and that does actually work really well because you're leveraging off, two people and responding in different ways. And also, one of the issues that's arisen, if you happen to be in a class and you end up with a teacher that you don't get along with or don't gel with, that can be a really destructive environment. And so I'm not necessarily saying we should go back. I think that in the going forward, we may have sort of thrown some of the baby out with the bathwater. And I think that's why I'm not completely against the ILEs, as they call them, but I think we do need to recognise that there are people and students and probably teachers actually that need alternative spaces to operate in, because and also that's the point about creative writing, mathematics, these things that really are done individually, and have to be done individually, making sure that the environment does cater for that. So and the old style, of course, that was the one person sitting up the front kind of trying to drill stuff into students, and that has a place for sure, but it's one of many ways in which you can deliver that information. So yeah.
Hi, Michael. I'm an architect, and I'm for sure that I consider myself to be an introvert. I'm currently doing a contract observation on a project, and I myself don't like confrontation, but the contractor has just been very difficult in a way. They just come up with every RFIs and just wanting every variations for most of the queries that come on site. So how do you deal in that situation when you consider yourself to be an introvert?
Right. Okay. So you're really talking about the kind of excessive stimulation that arises from the onslaught of that sort of information. Yeah.
Right.
Now, again, you have my sympathy. And I mean, that's tricky because that's a sort of contractual situation that you can't really get by. But I mean, for example, I used to suffer with that sort of thing. And in my case, I discovered meditation. I meditate sort of half an hour in the morning and 20 minutes in the evening. And that has certainly helped me get, I guess, calmer on the inside. And I was talking to Stephen earlier this morning about sort of even my struggle with the idea of presenting here today, is that, I did have a sleepless night. It is stressful for me to do this, because what I'm dealing with is the amygdala, is the really deep part of me that I can't undo. I can do all the cognitive behavioral stuff about saying, oh, Mike, it'll be fine, but actually that doesn't overcome the fear. But I think things like meditation, going for a walk, that will help to, I think, start to calm that down. And the way I sort of think of it is that, you've got a situation, classic sort of stress thing, stimulation and stimulus, and it goes to, you've got these neural pathways, and they're like the state highways running through your brain. So, okay, the RFI comes in, automatically it sets up a stress reaction. Now, by something like meditation, my view of that is it's trying to kind of create more matrices in your brain. So instead of everything pinging down State Highway 1, it'll take a little country lane somewhere, and that'll be, better for you. So that's probably the best advice I could give you. Yeah. Yes, there's one over here. Sorry, I'll get the mic across you.
On the bell curve, introvert, extrovert, is it nature driven, or can you nurture a fundamental change? Not fake it, but...
Yeah, sure. Well, as Susan Cain says in her book, Bill Gates will never be Bill Clinton. Okay, and that's a bit like, and this is what I was talking to Steve about, is that I can sort of pretend to be an extrovert and try to get to that end, but in truth, I can't do anything about the way that too much stimulation affects me. It's physiological, and I mean, meditation helps, and making sure that I go for a walk in nature, and making sure I don't go to too many parties in a week or something. I seem to get invited to more than one a week, but anyway, so I think. You can do a bit, but I don't think you can alter it too much, would be my observation. And this is where I have to admit that I'm not a neuroscientist and I'm not a psychologist. We know that our brains have a reasonable amount of plasticity, but this stuff does feel quite. And when I read about it, like the prefrontal cortex is great at retraining itself, learning new stuff, but the amygdala, it's like deeply buried, and it's hard to do anything about that. Yeah.
Presumably, Michael, Bill Gates could be a more effective Bill Gates.
Oh, sure, yeah, absolutely, and that's really that point about, to some extent we have. Well, I guess what I'm saying is, introverts ideally, pretend to be extroverts a bit more, and the extroverts, because Bill Clinton could have come a bit towards Bill Gates, or your classic sort of politician, and that would be better. Yeah. So I hope that sort of answers your questions. Well, I guess I gave some examples, like sort of trying to touch base with them individually is a good start. Like, so you trying to make some one-on-one connection is a way. Using perhaps sort of an online environment to elicit a contribution. Because to some extent you can do all the techniques you like what I've just done with post-it notes. Like I'm trying, but so far no one's written on one. But sort of just. Just trying to, I guess, because it's really shyness that prevents people from contributing in that situation. It's probably less to do with the introverted thing, and so you're trying to make people, I guess, feel safe and that they won't suffer humiliation. So so I guess in that sense, it's making you trying to make some connection with them, and also when they do take the social risk of contributing, that's rewarded really positively. Because it's the old sort of reward cycle. So. So that's, I mean, and I guess just working around that. I mean, it's a bit like what I was saying around the personality model, is that a lot of people aren't necessarily conscientious, so they are quite happy to just sit and not say anything just because they're not that conscientious about wanting to contribute. So there's all these factors that are reasons why people contribute. So I hope that's some way of an answer.
Hi, Michael. I have one question. So hearing from your examples of workplace, and it makes me reflect that the business world is almost, there are many elements that are invented by extroverts, socializing, going down to the pubs. It's all about being friendly and communicating with people, which for extroverts can be quite difficult. So the introverts will be quite difficult. So it's almost forcing the introverts to behave, to act like an extrovert. Do you think there's future with more awareness, there will be the pendulum might swing the other way, and introverts becoming more comfortable acceptable in the business world?
Yeah, well, I think as you see more introverts, and we do know that a number of good leaders are introverts anyway. I mean, the first thing I do is I'm just honest with people about my nature, so that if I do end up going to a function, for example, a work-related function, I'll just say, look, there's only so much noise or party time I can put up with. I'm leaving early, kind of thing. So that's the beginning of giving people the signal that not everybody wants to go to the rugby as a sort of corporate event. I mean, I hate the stadium. I just don't like large groups of people. Sorry, that's the way I am. And so getting people to think, oh well, what, and it is tricky, because what are you supposed to do? Go to the library, which is now closed anyway. But but it is about perhaps smaller social engagement. But I'd like to think that as we talk, a bit like we talk more about gender or we talk more about, temperament, that things might change a little bit. But, you're right, is that I think a lot of people, if they really look at themselves, are pretending to be something that they're not, is that they're sort of just, and it's a bit like what I was saying about do the critical thinking, is that are you really happy just, always offering the rugby, because it's all just part of the same sort of historical paradigm, if you like, so yeah. Okay, Mike, so one down here.
Yeah, I'm aware we're very close to 1:30. And I've just realized I am probably at the introvert end because I've sat here trying to formulate a question forever. It seems to me that what you've described, just using the innovative learning environment, is teachers have been saying, I believe, for at least 3 decades, the standard classroom doesn't work, at least in primary schools,
Right.
for the way they're trying to teach and the way they're trying to break children up into small groups.
Right.
And we have been experimenting as an attempt to try to provide spaces that deliver what they can't articulate. How do we build something that helps us to learn from those experiments? Because it seems to me we're getting people to say, oh, it's too noisy, it's too this, it's too that. And we're not actually learning and building a way of designing better to deliver what the teachers, the people who are the experts, are telling us they need in terms of flexibility. And that loop is what I'm fascinated by.
And I am conscious of the time, so I'll make this my last sort of answer. Well, I think the first thing is that we do is usual sort of research and reality, kind of trying to get those things together. I think that often the solutions are quite simple ones, like the MOE have just recently changed their requirements around acoustics, and that alone would make a dramatic difference to so many teaching environments. And I think that trying to use what we are building as a, like the book Inquiry by Design, is actually using what we are building as part of the experiment as ourselves. And the other thing is that just what we try to do is we really slow down as a company and do good briefing and do really hear from teachers as to how they want to work and try and sort of take a step back and not just do something formulaic. So yeah, I mean, and look, it's a bit like what I was writing about, the reading about the open plan environment. We'd like to think we do good open plan environments. We do deal with acoustics. We do provide quiet rooms. We do our best within the paradigm. So I think the other thing is that sometimes you're just often not necessarily dealing with good designers, that just kind of don't think it through enough. So anyway, yeah.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay.
And on many fronts, that's the 3rd time I've heard that, and it is a fascinating and deep conversation and enormous content. And I really appreciate the fact that you didn't sleep last night, and that suggesting that you do have a wander.
That's right.
On
Yes,
your
I
way
won't
back
be
to the studio.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be, this has been recorded, so it will be up on the website, and I think the content will also be for sharing with your colleagues. Michael's email address is in the top corner and is interested in that further conversation and so on.
Yes, if you think of any late questions,
any post-it note
that's
ones
right,
that can come through.
Work.
And it reminds us as we move to 1:30 that tolerance and inclusion and understanding are absolutely at the forefront of us as a better society. And so on that note, thank you, Michael. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, everybody. Yeah.